are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us now is Stephen Miles, who is the Advocacy Director for Win Without War. He is the coalition coordinator as well. It's a diverse coalition, 40-member organizations who came together in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and to the underlying national security strategy which created them. He's a veteran of campaign politics, grassroots advocacy. He's a graduate of the London School of Economics and of Tulane University with academic expertise in humanitarian interventions in Middle East politics. He's written recently about both the American public's view on military intervention in Syria and on the situation in Iraq. And of course, two of the three hotspots in the world today are Syria and Iraq. In addition, we now have the continued humanitarian crisis and tragedy in Gaza. So we have a lot to talk about with that. Stephen Miles, Win Without War, thanks so much for joining us on the Zero Hour.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I wish, we never seem to come together and have a conversation during happy circumstances, but that's the way it is right now, and that's the assignment we've both taken on in our respective ways. So I wanted to really talk to you about that underlying national security strategy that you talked about. But at first, we can talk a little bit about what's going on. Right now, these three countries are in the news, Iraq, Syria, and Gaza. But we also have Iran, and we also have the underlying patterns that these conflicts represent. But if you wouldn't mind, for our audience, just giving us a quick update at the close of this week as to what's going on in Iraq.
Sure, it's been an eventful week in Iraq. There's been a number of developments, primarily in northern Iraq, that I think are what most folks have seen in the news. So, starting a few days ago, the militants, formerly known as Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS or ISIL, as they're sometimes called, started a campaign, offensive against Kurdish positions, the Kurdish forces known as the Peshmerga. There was a series of kind of pitched battles in a number of towns in northern Iraq, with ISIS, for the most part, gaining the upper hand. Started to pick up the attention of the administration and others, and really kind of two things happened that are causing the situation we have now. The first is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50,000 members of an ethnic minority group, the Yazidis, were trapped on a mountain in kind of northern Iraq and stranded without any food or water up there. The second situation was that the forces got close to Erbil. The ISIS forces got close to Erbil, which is the capital of the Kurdish region, home to a U.S. consulate, which has a couple hundred of personnel, and some of the American military advisors. So in response to those developments, what we saw was the administration, the president announced two things last night. One was that the U.S. had conducted an airlift of food and water into the stranded Yazidis on the mountain and authorized military action if necessary to help protect them. The other was that the president authorized military action to help protect Erbil. Earlier today, we saw the first airstrikes as part of that. They were in relation to the situation in Erbil. There was some ISIS artillery pieces that were within range of Erbil, and two fighter jets from a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf bombed those locations. And once again, for the first time in this presidency, and unfortunately the fourth presidency in a row, we saw American bombs falling in Iraq.
So, and that's a very important point, that this is now the fourth president in a row to bomb this country. We'll get back to that. But now you mentioned that ISIS, or ISIL as it's sometimes known, that ISIS has munitions, heavy munitions, and it would be useful for people to understand, how did they get them?
Absolutely. So the shortest answer is that they got them from us.
Right.
We had, for years, spent several $1 billion supplying the Iraqi military forces with some heavy armaments, some very serious weapons, things like M1 Abrams tanks, armored Humvees, night vision goggles, rifles, all sorts of other types of weapons. As ISIS has traveled through Iraq and marched through Iraq and captured Iraqi military bases, they've captured those things. And so we're now in the position of potential U.S. airstrikes against U.S.-made tanks, for example. I mean, it's kind of a Kafka-esque situation, if you will, but it's part of the reality of the situation that we have been kind of flooding the region with munitions in the hopes of, quote-unquote, supplying the good guys. But as often happens in a situation like this, the quote-unquote bad guys got their hands on those very same weapons, and we find ourselves now facing a well-supplied enemy who is looking to use their own weapons against American interests.
And we'll get to the good guys and bad guys piece of it in a moment, because I also think that's important for our audience to understand. But we also face the possibility, for example, I assume, of an American military airplane being shot down by an American-made anti-aircraft gun, for example. So we're actually putting American lives at risk of being taken with American munitions. And along those lines, I did want to mention, even though we're talking about Iraq and not Afghanistan, that this week was the week that we also saw the killing of an American general, a two-star general. I believe that was this week, right?
Yeah, it was earlier this week. He was the highest-ranked military official, member of the U.S. military, killed in Afghanistan, killed in one of these quote-unquote insider attacks, where what we saw was someone wearing a uniform of an Afghan military. A bit unclear still if he was part of the Afghan military or someone else, but got into the installation and opened fire on the room where the general was. It's worth noting this took place at essentially the Afghan West Point. This was a general who was one of the leaders of training the Afghan forces. It was a tragic situation. It's a not uncommon situation, unfortunately, and it's one of the realities of that what's now, a war almost in its 13th year, or almost in its 14th year. I'm sorry.
And as this war goes into its 14th year, the parallel I was drawing, however imperfect, is that in this case, I mean, obviously ISIS obtained these weapons militarily, but what we're finding in Afghanistan in these insider cases is that frequently they are people we have both armed and trained, who, whether it's police or military, who then turn on us and use our own weapons against us, which suggests, I guess that's one of the through lines here, other than the kind of tragic irony of it all. One of the through lines is that it seems to me that we're entering into parts of the world that we don't understand very well. We're flooding those regions with arms, and we're in some cases training people with very little historical understanding of how they came to be where they are today. And in the end, not to be overly simplistic about it, but the gun sellers win and everybody else seems to be in the line of fire. Is that a fair way to interpret what's going on?
I think it's absolutely fair. I mean, I think it is a worthwhile analogy to draw. When you pour gasoline on a fire, it has a tendency to explode, right? That's the reality of the situation we're living in. It was exacerbated, or highlighted, just a couple weeks ago, actually. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, someone known as SIGAR in Washington, D.C. acronym speak, released a report that said there are hundreds of thousands of U.S.-supplied assault rifles in Afghanistan that the Afghans have no idea where they are. Now, they may have some, they may have most of them, but the fact is they have no system of tracking them, maintaining them. They don't know where they are. They don't know who they are. So the reality is very clearly not only with the insider attacks, but quite frankly also some of the members of the Taliban and others have probably been getting their hands on these weapons. And so we're finding our soldiers who are still out on patrol in Afghanistan, who are still out in harm's way, being shot at with American weapons that we gave into the conflict.
And we also have the case, since I know a little bit more about money than I do about guns, where enormous amounts of cash have been infused into both Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't know where a lot of that money is, too. So we have cash, we have guns. How did we get in the situation where we're just flooding a nation with guns and then losing track of them?
I think part of the problem is that we come to these situations quite frequently where we have a very understandable impulse to want to do something and to want to do something to help the situation. But the problem is we have very few tools in our toolkit to be able to do that. And after decades of only funding the military, after decades of shoveling hundreds of billions of dollars at the Pentagon, at the same time, we're defunding our diplomatic efforts. We're defunding the State Department, defunding development agencies. We're not doing things like helping democracy development. We're not doing things that actually help people avoid some of these conflicts. Every time one of these problems happens, the only thing that we have in our toolkit is the military. And so we reach for the military. We say, here's a problem. Let's throw some bombs at it and see if that solves it. And of course, it never does. But when all you have at your disposal is the world's most highly trained, well-equipped military, it becomes very, very tempting to just reach for that as a quote-unquote simple solution to what are inevitably complex problems that we don't understand. And until we have a real serious reorientation of our foreign policy and understanding that we have to demilitarize our foreign policy, we're going to keep finding ourselves back in this same situation every time another crisis develops around the world.
Well, and I want to get back to that whole idea of a demilitarized foreign policy. I'm just making a note to myself now so that I don't forget. But the other element that I think people don't realize about, or many people don't realize about Iraq, because even the presidential candidate John McCain was fuzzy on it, is that it's probably the Yazidis are also members of a small religious minority as well as an ethnic minority, but primarily there has historically been a conflict between Sunni and Shiite Muslims in that country, and ISIS represents the Sunni segment, whereas the Shiite majority now controls the government. And one of the things that got us into this mess, now this is me talking, and you understand this area better than I do, so correct me whenever I'm wrong. But one of the things I want to get to, especially when we come back to break, but maybe you can give us a brief thing, is to what extent did we misread the Sunni-Shiite split and maybe have too much faith in Maliki as a leader?
We have misread this situation from the get-go. I mean, we're talking today about relying on the Peshmerga, the Kurdish military forces. There was a serious effort in the early part of the war during the Bush administration to demilitarize the Peshmerga, to disband them, to get rid of them. That just kind of tells you the craziness of where we are today. A lot of the decisions that were made early on by folks like Paul Bremer, by folks like Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, names that kind of should haunt us when we hear them again. A lot of the decisions that were made with no understanding of the ethnic divide, no understanding of the religious divide in the situation. We're living today with the consequences of those decisions. And as tempting as it is to try to think that we can solve them, they're problems that were created decades ago. They're problems that were exacerbated by decisions made years ago. And there's really no quick and easy solution today that we have to fix them.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get back from break. We're talking with Stephen Miles of the World Without War Coalition about the situation in Iraq. We'll also get to a couple other conflict zones as well. So please stick with us. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and with us again is Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director for Win Without War, which I mistakenly called World Without War in the last segment, without even knowing I was making that mistake, because I know the name is Win Without War. And so let's just take this opportunity briefly before we go back to the situation in Iraq. Stephen, would you mind just telling our audience for a minute what the Win Without War Coalition is, who it is?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, happy to. We would like a world without war too. So if there's a mistake to be made, that's not a bad one. Okay. The Win Without War Coalition is coming together of about 36 national organizations that originally came together in 2002 in the original run-up to the Iraq War. It was groups who didn't necessarily work on these kinds of issues, but felt the need to come together because of how disastrous the Iraq War would be for American policy, both foreign and domestic. I mean, the impacts we've seen in terms of the trillions of dollars spent and the thousands of American lives lost, really have long-lasting domestic impacts. And so the groups have continued to stay together as a coalition, working for years to finally end that war, working on other issues like preventing a war with Iran, helping to bring our troops home from Afghanistan. And now, unfortunately, we're right back where it all began, trying to make sure that the U.S. doesn't get embroiled in another war in Iraq.
And exact. So sadly, we've come full circle, and you guys put out a statement on the situation in Iraq, which begins as follows: the Win Without War coalition remains deeply opposed to a U.S. military intervention that places our men and women in uniform in harm's way in Iraq, which must have given you a sense of deja vu to write. It goes on to say, we must not become a Kurdish air force in a sectarian civil war. As history has shown, it concludes it is impossible to bomb your way to peace. So here we have a situation where, from the beginning, we intervened, we destabilized the situation where a Sunni minority had been exerting control through Saddam Hussein, and now we unleashed the dogs of sectarian civil war. And by the way, I should add that around the world, Sunni and Shiite Muslim clerics have gotten together, including in this country, to proclaim their one community, and they reject the divisiveness. But in a situation like Iraq, where these sectarian divisions also break down along village and sometimes tribal lines and so on, they're very deeply embedded. We didn't understand that. We destabilized the situation. We've got this tragedy going on now. If as we both agree, you and I, it is impossible to bomb your way to peace, what is the way forward in Iraq, and what is our role in it as a nation?
Well, so there's a couple different things there. There's first and foremost a humanitarian crisis with the Yazidis, as we talked about earlier. And I think it's important to point out that there is a role the U.S. can play there. And it's one of the nice opportunities where we can use all of that money that we've spent putting together military resources, and we can use it to do something like drop food and water for people who are frankly dying of thirst and starvation. And we can provide an immediate relief for those folks. And we did that yesterday. There's likely to be some more missions there. And that is one of those types of situations where there is a unique role the U.S. military can play. By most reports, when the Iraqi Air Force tried to do this, they botched it, and most of the water that they dropped to those folks was spilled. And there's some real unique capacities we have, and if we have an opportunity, we shouldn't hesitate to use those. What we shouldn't do is get caught up in a civil war that frankly has been going on for decades. We are now potentially becoming a Kurdish Air Force. We're inserting ourselves directly in the middle of it, and we're risking making Sunnis, who most Sunnis, the vast majority of them, want nothing to do with the horrible militants of ISIS, of the Islamic State. They're brutal. They have just desecrated everything that they've touched. Their violence is kind of unspeakable. But what you see is a conflict in which Sunnis are being asked to choose between them and a corrupt government that was providing them no security, that was threatening their lives, and which frankly treats them as the enemy. And so in that situation, given that choice, folks have made the calculus that it's better to side with the Sunnis of ISIS than it is to side with the government in Baghdad or the Kurds in Erbil. Changing that calculus is the fundamental thing that needs to happen to change the dynamics on the ground. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 ISIS soldiers, militants. They are incredibly well armed. They are incredibly well financed. But the reality is they're only able to do what they're doing because of the underlying political willingness of so many people to go along with them. You can't begin to solve this problem until you change that calculus. And as the president himself said, there is not a military solution to this conflict. And when we find ourselves in a position where there is no military solution, what we saw in Iraq the last time, what we're seeing in Afghanistan still today, is that when you throw bombs at the problem, it ends up very, very badly.
So if we agree that we shouldn't be throwing bombs, then the answer is A, humanitarian aid, and B, looking for other solutions. Now, 10,000 combatants in ISIS is a large number, but I'm trying to remember the total population of Iraq. Is it 18 million, 20 million, something like that? Do you know offhand?
It's about 20 million. There's several 100,000 between Iraqi security forces and various militias. So this is not kind of a question of numbers, right? This is a significant number of people. But don't forget those 10,000 are also spread over a conflict that, frankly, is stretching from Lebanon all the way over to Iraq at this point. And so they, again, would not be able to do that were it not for the fact that Sunni tribes are taking up arms with them, that former members of Saddam's regime, who, frankly, never probably liked Saddam very much, but they were in his regime, and when we went in last time, we kicked them all out of their jobs. We said there was no place for them. A lot of them have taken up arms and are now fighting alongside of these Islamic militants, the ISIS militants. And so you see those numbers grow, but you also see that there's an ability to get rid of them. There's an ability to isolate them, make them be seen as alone. Part of that problem, though, is that the other players in the region, the Arab states in the Gulf, our friends in Turkey and elsewhere, until they feel that there's a viable partner in Baghdad to work with, they're not going to tolerate that. They're not going to make peace. They're not going to tell their friends in Iraq that they need to stop fighting side by side with ISIS. And so a huge part of this is dealing with the problem that the Maliki administration created. And it's frankly deeper than simply just getting rid of Maliki. There has to be a real movement toward inclusiveness and an Iraqi-led solution that the Iraqis of all stripes can learn to agree with. And they're going to have to tell us what that solution is. Trying to impose that solution on them is how we got in this mess in the first place.
And that's a great point. But what I'm trying to, you understand what I'm trying to get to, which is what is the approach we should support? And it sounds like what you're saying is basically it's telling the Iraqis they need to come up with an alternative that works, because we went in, we took out the government of Saddam Hussein, but we were careless about what we replaced it with. We took essentially an entire generation of civil servants and army members and dismissed them without consideration for their motives or what they would do once they were put out on the street. And then we basically looked the other way. And frankly, I would blame that on the Obama as well as the Bush administrations, although Bush was the one who got us into this mess, and I wouldn't hang that around President Obama's neck. But we allowed leaders like Maliki and his coalition partners to take over and provided very little attention or direction in terms of what we might like to see. And it's a tough one to nuance. It's a tough one to structure, what we should have said, what we should have done. But here we are. What should we be asking our elected officials? What should we be insisting that our elected officials do instead of showering the country with bombs?
Well, so you have to go back to that old adage, first do no harm. I mean, if this was kind of a one-off situation where we just got it wrong once with Iraq, you might be willing to say, let's give it another go, let's try. When you look at Afghanistan, not only did we get it wrong with the Mujahideen in the 80s, we got it wrong again with the Karzai government now. And you see this kind of time and time again as we get involved in these messes all around the world. We're very, very bad at picking winners and losers. We're very bad at understanding the situation thousands of miles away. And we really need to have a predisposition to not get in the middle of it. But there are some things we can do. You're absolutely right. So humanitarian response, both in terms of the immediate things like dropping food and water we talked about, but also helping deal with the refugee crisis with millions of displaced people in the region. They require shelter. They require food. The governments that are housing them require support to do so. And it may be that the case that there is some security needs or some needs for stabilization. If that's the case, what we should be looking to do is have a multilateral response, a truly international response. You know, there's opportunities to discuss this and take action through the UN. There's opportunities to engage not only our international partners in Europe, but also our partners in the region, like the Turks. There's conversations that are apparently being had with the Iranians, who, of course, are closer to Erbil than Erbil is to Baghdad. There's a lot, in terms of geography, there's a lot that can be done with folks in the area. Again, some of that requires us, frankly, being less involved and propping up one side versus another less than we are. And once American bombs start falling, what you see is that protecting the American pilots flying those missions, protecting any troops that end up there on the ground, that becomes our overarching interest. And understandably so. Protecting American lives is incredibly important. But you can't then do all those other things if you have a singular focus on protecting American lives. And so you have to be very, very careful about making the types of decisions that we're now talking about making.
Well, Stephen Miles of Win Without War, if you're willing to stick with us just a little longer, we'll take a break, and then I have a couple final questions for you, including the question, which may sound strange, do we really need to learn a kind of humility in these situations? But we'll get to that when we get back. We're talking with Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War, about the situation in Iraq. We will be right back after these messages. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour talking with Stephen Miles, who is the Advocacy Director of Win Without War, and we're talking about the situation in Iraq. And Stephen, before we went to break, we were talking about an approach the U.S. government and the American people could take toward this conflict that involved bringing in regional players, European players, other allies. Sounds, part of my reaction had several reactions. One was, do we really need to learn that we can't do it all, that we can't fix it all, that there are situations where, and that we shouldn't try to fix it all, that it's up to the Iraqi people and the people of the region to work this out, and that perhaps our best role could be to say we are withdrawing from a military place in this conflict and would be happy instead to facilitate A, humanitarian relief, and B, perhaps a series of conferences where we figure out how to allow the people in the region to make their own decisions.
Yeah, I mean, look, RJ, I think you're absolutely right. It's time, unfortunately, after kind of the dark lessons we've had to learn over the last 13 years, that we do have a little humility about what we can do and what we can't do. Now, it's one thing to note, though, that the American public have learned that lesson. When you look at kind of polls of the American public, or frankly, when you talk to anyone, you talk to people around the dinner table or in their living rooms, they get it. They understand there are limits to what we can do. It's frankly a lot of talking heads here in Washington who just don't get that message. You know, we've seen a real kind of clear response from Republicans here in D.C. that they not only support kind of the airstrikes in Iraq, but many of them saying we need to consider things like ground troops. Many of them saying this whole problem is that Obama somehow created this problem by ending the Iraq war and bringing our troops home. And many of them saying we're doing too little and we need to do much more. I mean, I think the American people look at that and they just think, what are you talking about? That is just not comport with the reality of the world that we live in and the reality of the situation that we've seen. This gets called kind of war weariness or isolationism a lot. I think those are not accurate descriptions. What's much more accurate is that the American public has learned the lesson you're talking about. People get it. They get there are limits to what we can do. And if two people want to kill each other and the only thing you can do is stand in between them and hope that they don't shoot you, or try to find a way to convince them not to kill each other. That's the reality of the situation we're in.
Well, so you've worked in politics, Stephen, and you know how the political process works. Do we need to, don't get run over, please.
Sorry about that.
Do we need to, we need you. So do we need to work on our friends in the Democratic Party to be a little bolder about challenging that rhetoric and saying, no, this is not how the world works, and, you know, we're not playing John Wayne in a cowboy movie with other people's lives anymore? Do we need to shift the rhetoric?
Yeah, absolutely. The Democrats, you know, and progressives and kind of folks of all political stripes need to have a little more backbone and be willing to say, we've been right about most of this for the last several years. You know, we were right when we said the Iraq war was a disaster. And these guys who are listening to the Bill Kristols of the world, who said something completely different, who said we were going to be treated as liberators, that we should go in, you know, if they want to live in Dick Cheney's America, they can go off and they can try to create that somewhere else. But we were right, and that means we get to control what happens now. We get to decide where we go from here. You do need to have more ownership of that. There should be accountability. One of the problems we have is that there's no accountability. You know, you see Dick Cheney back out there on the Sunday TV shows talking about this stuff as if he didn't have the blood of thousands of Americans on his hands, as if there wasn't chaos throughout the Middle East from the very policies he pursued. The people who were right about this stuff the last time around they're the ones we should be listening to now. And a lot of the voices like John McCain and a lot of those other guys in Washington, we need to stop listening to them because they keep getting it wrong.
And absolutely, I like your tone, man. Right now, I'm really digging your tone, number one. Number two, because I think we need to have the cojones to say that this is madness.
There was the last, when all this started back in June, Meet the Press, the venerable DC institution has Paul Bremer on there, the guy who created most of this mess in Iraq with his horrible decisions. And no one says anything, hey, you were completely wrong. I mean, it took Dick Cheney going on Fox News and a Fox News anchor to say, but you've been wrong about all this. Democrats need to have some spine to stand up and say, hold on a second. If you've been wrong about the Middle East for the several last decades, you don't get to talk about it anymore. And if we've been right about it, we should have a chance to say, this is what we've been saying, and it's time we tried it out.
Yeah, and I always say asking those guys about Iraq is like asking the captain of the Exxon Valdez for navigation tips. It's just they're the guys who sank the whole thing. So the question now is, first of all, what do people do when they hear this conversation or conversations like it, and they want to do something about it? They want to communicate with their elected representatives. They want to join their voices with voices like yours. What do they do? Where do they go?
So absolutely. So our website is www.winwithoutwar.org. On there's a number of resources. Our statement you mentioned earlier, folks can use our website to contact the members of Congress. But one of the nice things about my job is that I work for a coalition. And I'm sure that most of the people listening to this show are actually already members of some of the coalition members that we have. Great groups like Move On, like Cradle. Folks are going to be getting emails from them in the next couple of days. Folks are going to be being asked to take action, whether it's by them or another organization. Open those emails, take action. Your voice matters. It's almost exactly a year ago that we had a similar situation come up in Syria. And I got to tell you, the fighter jets were on the tarmac. They were fueled up. The bombs were loaded. We were really ready to go on that one. And the only thing that changed is that Americans stood up by the millions and they said, no way, not again, we're not going to do it. And if Americans feel that way, they need to have their voices heard. This was a very complicated situation. No one's expecting that the folks listening to this call or average Americans have all the answers. But what they can do is that they know there are things that they don't want to see. They don't want to see America back in another war in Iraq. Then they should tell their members of Congress that, and they should say, this is why we elected you. Go find another solution. They don't have to have all the answers, but they should feel free to say what they feel.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but extremely well said. And thanks so much for joining us, Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War at winwithoutwar.org. We'll keep abreast of this situation. I hope you'll come back and join us again on the 0 Hour.
Happy to be on anytime. Have a good day, RJ.
Thanks, you too. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be back after this on the 0 Hour.